Wax on, wax off. Don't forget to breathe. Very important.
Relax. It's time to expand your horizons. My name is Jake, and this is the Photoshop and Illustrator Unleashed podcast. Today we have an extra special guest for our podcast. I sit down and talk with Mike Frederick, who's not only an amazingly experienced and professional designer, but also the instructor of Design Bootcamp right here on School of Motion. As you'll hear, he is just a waterfall of knowledge, and we had such a great conversation getting to talk through how he views the design world and how design ties into motion design and where his career has taken him. It was super interesting for me to find out that he was basically at the start of the motion design industry. And not only motion design, but digital design, when people first started using computers for design work. It's a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Well, hey Mike, thanks so much for talking to our students today.
Thank you, Jake. I am so thrilled to be here. This is about Photoshop and Illustrator. I love Photoshop and Illustrator. I think I've spent 25 years using Photoshop.
That's fantastic.
I guess it is.
Yeah. Well, you're in good company. We've got people who are probably not quite as experienced as that, but we'd love to be able to just pick your brain a little bit about what you do and how you're using these pieces of software.
Well, years does not equal good experience. I think years is just years, and some people probably spend a year with Photoshop and they probably blow me away. So there you go. That's all right. That's my disclaimer, okay?
Good point. Okay. Good to know.
All right.
Well, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself so we can just kind of hear your story a little bit, how you became a designer, where you've worked, and what you're doing now.
All right. Well, I'll try to make it quick because, of course, it goes back a few years. But okay. From a very early age, I always loved just like looking through art books and comic books, and I just loved to go into the movies to experience like sort of the visual magic, on the big screen. I just loved those kind of things. So from a very early age, I just wanted, to infuse art and design and just things that I thought that were aesthetically great sort of into my life very early. And so I also loved, like when my family traveled, for example, it was cool as you're traveling to see sort of the changing world outside the car, right? It's like, as an artist, that was at a very early age for myself. And I thought, this feels really good. It's like I always had some sort of fascination with the visualness of life. Like I always was sort of just enamored with what was going on visually around me in everything. And so from a very early sort of time in my life, I started to sketch and to just draw. And I started to fill up sketchbooks, and I really started to fall in love with this idea of becoming like an artist. And I was, pretty young when I started to feel that way, but I didn't really know what it meant, and I didn't know, what was going to happen, down the road. So through those years, I worked, really hard at, drawing and sketching and just trying to look at the world and sort of see it in a way that made sense to me. So anyway, so a few years go by and work very hard, create a small body of work, and this is all like painting and drawing because computers did not exist. And I got an art scholarship to go to art school. So I went to art school and studied painting and illustration. Because again, we had computers, but it was like Amiga computers. I mean, they were, really archaic, and
sure.
The screens were like black and white, I think. So they didn't really like factor in my career or what I thought my career was going to be, because I was thinking at the time I was going to be a painter. I was going to be an artist. I was going to have my studio, and I was going to, paint pictures and have one-man shows and sell paintings. So in art school, I did figure anatomy drawing, I did life drawing, skeletal drawing. I tried to learn about creating concepts based on themes or topics. Just did a lot of practice looking and seeing the world in really abstract ways, studied the world in terms of like positive and negative space. And I just tried to understand like why some visual relationships worked better than others, right?
Yeah.
And so I tried to understand why those things worked, and I wanted to sort of figure out how to make things look and feel right. There was like that feeling inside me that, I just wanted to make things have a good sort of aesthetic feeling. And so that was where I think the artist designer, in all of us sort of comes from. It's that sort of like need or feeling that you want to make things feel good. And so anyway, during that period when I was in school, that was kind of what I was practicing. I was practicing looking and exploring how to make things look a certain way. So when people saw my work, there was some sort of emotional tie. So anyway, it was a lot of abstract thought and processes back then, but it was all built around, tactile things such as paint and charcoal and
right.
in drawing. So it had nothing to do with the computer, but I think in many ways that was great. So I started to, at that point, discover like new artists, new creative techniques, and sort of new ways to be creative. And then that sort of transitioned into, well, now how can I start to make money being a creative person? Because my whole life I was interested in doing that. So all of that led me to the point where I wanted to work in my own studio and work towards being like the next great artist, like a Jeff Koons or Jean-Michel, Basquiat. I just wanted to be like this rock star artist. But as we all know, that's incredibly difficult to do because you need a ton of luck, and it's really difficult because it's a very narrow window that you're trying to work within. So while all that was happening, I got out of art school and I was like, okay, I'm going to be an artist. And then I basically said, I have no clients, nobody's buying my work. And so it only took a few months for me to sort of discover that this is probably not a good way to go. And at that time, I happened to stumble into an internship because computers and computer-driven art was really the new frontier at that time. And we're talking about like 1991, 1990. So we're talking computers, were not really, in most businesses, and certainly they weren't driving the motion design industry like it is now. So it was a really very new frontier. And so people like me, we all jumped from the paintbrush to the computer mouse, right? Mm-hmm. Because that was what was happening. So at that point, I stumbled into this internship at CNN in Atlanta, Georgia, and I really knew nothing about computers, and I just sort of stumbled into that job because of my portfolio of illustrations. They thought, there was potential there, but at the time I said, well, I know nothing about computers, and they said, well, no one does. So, most of us are painters and, graphic designers. We did paste up work, we did print work. And so at the time it was the wild, wild west. It was basically no one knew anything. It was like, here's a computer. And the computer I worked on was probably $750,000 for that one computer. I mean, that's
wow.
how expensive they were, and they were proprietary computers. So it wasn't working on a Mac. So right. And there was in Adobe, I think Illustrator and Photoshop had only been out for a year or two, so it was very, very new. So I started at CNN, and I was doing broadcast TV design, is what that was called back then. It wasn't really called motion design; it was broadcast TV design. And that was where I got my first taste of using typography, composition, making graphic designs that basically communicated an idea to a larger audience than myself or a few of my friends. So that was really the first taste I had of like, oh, I'm a graphic designer, but it's for TV, and some things are moving and some things aren't. So what is this? So at that point, I sort of dipped my toe into the waters, and I said, okay, well, this feels good because I'm still using my creative side, but it's a little different because, it's not painting or drawing exclusively. It's doing stuff on the computer, and that was kind of, new and unique for everyone. So then I was at CNN for probably a year and just doing designs because we didn't know what else we were doing there. We were just playing around with equipment and tape machines, and we were doing all sorts of like digital feedback through tape machines and recording that and spitting that back into another machine and just messing around. It was a lot of just messing around and trying to see what you can do. So then I moved to Boston and started working for various design agencies, and that's where I started to sort of, and this was probably the probably 94, somewhere in there.
Okay.
So that was where some of these design agencies were working for people like, Fox, NBC, CBS, Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, HGTV, HBO, Showtime. So at that time, I jumped from different design agencies. I probably had 10 different jobs during that period. And it was literally just going from one place to the next, to the next, to the next, getting more experience. And so during this period, I basically built a portfolio because I was working with basically the very small group of U.S. cable TV networks. Because at that time, again, we did not have Hulu, we did not have Netflix, we didn't have that kind of stuff. So it was very narrow, and the design agencies, there weren't a lot out there. There were only a few in some of the bigger cities in America and places like London, Paris. Some of the European countries had, some pretty good firms, but these firms were, you didn't do stuff very quickly. I mean, everything was done very slowly. So during that time, it was just a lot of exploration and just trying to figure out how the computers and the programs that we were using, what could they do? Because we didn't know. Right. And so, that was sort of the 90s and I would say the early 2000s, and then once we started to get into like the mid 2000s, then I started to be like design director, creative director of different firms, and then and now I work for myself, and so I transitioned from working for design agencies to now working for myself, and I basically create everything from branding projects to explainer video type of projects. Logo design, print design, product advertising. I work on integrated marketing campaigns. So the way I look at it is my portfolio is kind of like a financial portfolio. You have different buckets of things that you're doing.
Sure.
And so my portfolio, I would say half of it is motion design type of work, and the other half is branding, print design, marketing sort of stuff. So I look at design as a state of mind, and it's not really like, I don't look at design as like I'm a designer who does this. I'm a designer because I think that way. So therefore, I don't put a stamp on myself. I basically say, when you learn how to fundamentally design, you can apply that to various things. And that's sort of the power of looking at creativity within different buckets, is you don't have to just be exclusive to one thing. You can be well-rounded. You can do what you want. You can basically get tired of something and do something else. And it's really exciting that way. So the way I look at myself now is I'm kind of a consultant, but I do a lot of different things, and it's not exclusive to one like bucket, like motion design or print design. I do everything because design is design, and that's the way I look at it.
That's fantastic. I love everything that you just said. We covered so much in just that initial little bit of a history of your storyline. I want to dig into a lot of it, but
sure,
the one thing that stood out to me a lot was that from very early on, you realized that you saw the world in a specific way, and you were learning how to look at the world in a specific way, and you were paying attention to how certain things made you feel. And I think that's such a key thing as a designer. Like you said, seeing how something feels right, and how putting two objects next to each other will make you feel. And I think that a lot of times today, with how accessible these computer programs are to just jump in and start making things without really having to even put much thought into them, it can be very easy to not stop and think about how something is working together, how it's making you feel, or thinking about how it's going to make somebody else feel. So it's much more about just playing around with, shapes and colors and making something wacky and having fun, which I think is a great place to start. But I think the very next step you need to have is starting to train your design eye and recognizing that the way that you're putting things together is going to make a specific feeling come out of that project.
That is correct, because design is visual communications, and most designers are hired by clients who want you to do a specific thing. And so therefore, you have to understand not only what the project is, but your client has a specific audience, and you need to make sure you understand what that audience is. So when you do your design, you're using the design fundamentals and principles to help guide the way it looks aesthetically. But it also has to feel a certain way because that audience wants it a certain way, and that's what you're being paid to do. So you're using very simple rules of engagement to your design, which are the design principles, and then you turn that into a visual communication, which then communicates to the audience that you're being paid to communicate to.
Right.
So you're right. It's the programs that we use, the Photoshops, the Illustrators, it's just a tool. Design and animation, motion design, is that state of mind which is aesthetic. And that aesthetic transfers directly to your client, and that's why you get paid. So if you want to do something on your own as a personal project, well, that's different. You're the client. But in a world where we get paid to make clients happy, these programs, they're the tool, but it's our mind and the way we look at the world. Because individual people, Jake, you and I are completely different. The way you look at Illustrator and Photoshop is completely different than me, but the result is sometimes the same. And that is where a lot of people get hung up and like, oh, I need to know this. Well, you know something? You know a lot more about the program probably than I do, because I've never really cared about, like which hotkey am I doing that right? Sometimes I don't even care. And I've worked in studios with people, and they go, why are you doing that? I'm like, I don't know, that's just the way I do it. And they're like, well, if you just did this, it would be easier. And sometimes I accept what I hear and go, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And I actually adopt what I hear, and then I actually put it into my workflow. So again, it's not about the buttons you're pushing. It's really about the outcome. And so the way that you do it and the way I do it is going to be different, but the outcome is what we're really concerned about. But when you're working on a program for 25 years, it becomes part of you, and so you need to sort of accept that process. So yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a great point that I'm also trying to communicate to our students right now, is that I'm teaching Photoshop and Illustrator in this course the way that I feel is the most efficient and the smartest way to approach the programs if you've never done them before. But 5 years from now, the two programs could look completely different, and there might be better techniques and better workflows and faster hotkeys.
That's right.
Like you said, the end result is what matters.
That's right.
Because if you work in a different way than I do, that's fine.
That's right. Because these programs will change, and I've seen them change drastically over the years, but they take baby steps. And as that change happens, you adopt the new things, but then you have to adapt the way you work and the way you see things. But design in particular is a very fundamental thing. And once you sort of figure out where to start and where a design begins and why it works, then you don't have any limits, basically, because the program then doesn't really become the idea of design. It's not, program does not design, you design. And so once you start that fundamental phase as a designer and you're using a program like Photoshop or Illustrator, it's just sort of the little things, the little quirks that you find within the program that just, make your design a little better. And that's what it's all about. It's about finding those little moments in the program that help you. So while you're working for 10 hours every day on the program, it just speeds up your workflow, but also makes you feel like when you're engaged with the program, the program developer wants you to feel a certain way when you're using their product. So you want to have a Zen moment with the program so you can actually use it for 10 hours every day, So, but each person is different, and that's how it works.
Well, that leads us right into, I am curious, what are your preferred tools for design? I'm assuming you use Photoshop a lot.
Yep, Photoshop is pretty much it. I use Illustrator sometimes. I just got off a job recently where the animator wanted or requested that I create the board in Illustrator. So I used artboards and I created, probably 35 frames. And, it wasn't much of a learning curve for me because I was just using a lot of clipping masks. But basically, I had to create all my artboards and set up everything in Illustrator and use that one master file for sort of the handoff of the actual design and the design board to the animator. So in that case, I used Illustrator, but it was a lot just typography, a couple of solid colors. It was very minimalistic and very simple. But usually I use Photoshop because I do a lot of photo manipulation. I do a lot of different weird things with color. I try to blend textures on colors, and so Photoshop is just, for me, it just feels more natural because from a painting point of view, that made a lot more sense to me when I first started to design. I said, well, Photoshop makes sense because my mind is set up like a painter. So a lot of people listening may say, hey, I like print design, or I like, certain web design techniques. And so therefore, they may feel better using Illustrator. People that are a little more textural may feel like Photoshop is the way to go. Because I look at Photoshop every time I sit down and use it, which is pretty much every day. I look at it as like a big table. Like when I open up Photoshop and the windows pop open, I hit Command N. Here's a new document. I look at the document when it's floating. I look at it as a floating piece of paper, and then everything around it, all the tools and everything, it's like a big giant table. And I've got my scissors and my paintbrush and my pen, and I look at it as like a scrapping table where I get to cut things out and I move it over here, and I usually have multiple floating windows, so I'm kind of messy, but it makes sense to me because that's how my mind sort of works when I use the program, which I think is important, that people know that the program can be used in different ways based on your mindset. So if you have tendencies to, sort of move stuff around and kind of look at things really small and then look at it really big. And, you may want to float your windows so you can actually move stuff around and move your palettes and all that kind of stuff. You can just move those things around wherever you want. That's what I do. And some people don't. Some people prefer it all to be contained and never move, and that's fine too. So again, I think it goes back to who you are, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. And that's just another one of those points that I want to hammer into the students, that I'm showing you the way that I think is a good way to get into these programs, the way that we're setting up our panels and things. But that, honestly, the way that you're seeing me in the lessons work with these panels isn't typically the way that I have my panels set up when I'm actually working on a job.
That's right.
And that's just something that comes with time and experience and knowing the way that you work, the way that you want to work.
Yeah, when people take design boot camp, they're going to find out another way to do everything, because I'm totally different, as you remember. I'm totally different than Jake, and Jake is totally different than other people, and that's the great thing about these programs. It's a tool for your state of mind. And that state of mind changes per person, because that's why we all have different styles and different ways of doing everything. But at the end of the day, you try to create the outcome to be a really good outcome, and that's what you're selling. But your process becomes who you are, and that's cool.
That is very cool. I love that approach of the programs and the way that you think of them, kind of just getting that Zen moment. That's great. I'm curious, are you using any kind of traditional tools as well with your design process? Anything like pencils and paper or any paint?
Sometimes if, I just got off a couple of jobs where I actually, ripped out my big paintbrush and had some like 300-pound cold pressed watercolor paper, and I kind of did a couple of big brush strokes and was doing some stuff and scanned it in. I have a big scanner that I use, and I scan stuff in, and so occasionally I'll do that. Sometimes of course I've got a couple of sketchbooks, and I'll just sit around and doodle some blocking. Like when I'm about to start a design board, I'll block out some of the basic forms using, pen or pencil to sort of block out the composition, the hierarchy, the balance, the contrast, just to get sort of the quick foundation and the structure of the design idea. And so that's a good way to do it, because you're not, if you mess up, you just kind of, exit out and scribble it out and do it again. So that's one way to do it, and I've done that sometimes. Sometimes I don't do it. Sometimes if it's all typography or something, I won't do it, because I can do that very quickly, either in Illustrator or Photoshop, and the outcome that you see is pretty quick. So it just kind of depends on what the project is and what you feel like you need to do. So so sometimes I will use traditional, pencil, like a rapidograph pen, and I'll make some marks or some sketches that, you can't really pull off using some of the Photoshop brushes. And it just creates that natural feel that I want for whatever design. And I'll use that. So I think it really depends on the project. And some people, I use a mouse a lot, and a lot of people, say, God, don't use a mouse. Why would you do that? Well, when you're doing really precision sort of work and you're dealing with typography and you're doing lots of kerning and whatnot, sometimes the mouse, for me, it just, like when I click on it, it gives me a really clean sort of cut where I want something.
Right.
And with the, and I have a tablet, but I don't use it. I only use it when I'm drawing in Photoshop or sort of erasing something or painting, but I normally don't use it. And some people are like, why would you? But I have used a huge tablet. 10 years ago I was working on machines, and that's all I was using. So I went from a tablet back to a mouse, back to a tablet, a mouse. It just kind of jumped based on the time in my career. And so it makes no sense. It just happens. But a lot of people are purists, and they'll say, nope, I'll only do this. And something? That's fine. Yeah. You can do whatever the hell you want to do, and that's how it should be.
Totally. So you talked about, like 10 years ago you were using a tablet. I'm curious, but you were there in this industry just as Photoshop and Illustrator were starting up, and you said that nobody really knew what to do with a computer at that point. I'm curious, what was it like? Did you have any experience prior to that in the design world as to how a workflow of any piece actually was put together without a computer?
No, it was all analog. I remember the people that were before me, it was all like in-camera sort of shooting. Like you had to take a camera, and usually those cameras, back in the early 90s, they were big cameras that were very expensive, and you had to go to a studio, and everything was analog. It was digital. Digital was a brand new thing. I mean, just the word digital, everybody's like, ooh, it's digital. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? They're like, oh, it's digital, man. I'm like, okay. I had
totally
no
different
clue.
World.
Yeah, I had no clue. But everything was, back then, before Photoshop and Illustrator, it was just sort of slow, clunky. a little strange. I use the word, like analog. There was lots of bad design and bad decisions going on because a lot of people, were just trying to tinker with the programs and these big, expensive machines and cameras. It was just a lot of tinkering to see what you could break and what would work. And so,
right.
When I was, in my early 20s, the masters of design, the people that I sort of looked at and said, that's good, that's good taste, that's good design. People like Saul Bass, Paul Rand, Neville Brody, Muriel Cooper, Kyle Cooper, Marlene McCarty. She was doing some pretty terrific sort of title sequences back then. David Carson. David Carson was really... he was kicking it good back then, and we all wanted to be, like David Carson. He was kind of the rock star back then, but he was all print. He was just doing a bunch of like print magazine layouts for Raygun, I believe, and he was doing like surfer magazines. He was a big surfer. So, it was just the whole motion design thing was just not there. So it was just kind of, hey, let's scan this thing right here into that computer over there, that thing over there. Let's just kind of scan that in and sort of mess with it. That was kind of that was the philosophy was, we didn't have tutorials. Tutorials did not exist. And people like us, we were not talking on a podcast. We were not, we just weren't doing this. So it was really tough to sort of say, oh, I'm going to be a motion designer. And here are the three easy steps. There were no easy steps. It was literally like, let's shoot this and let's take a picture of it and then let's print it. Because again, you didn't have digital, you didn't have phones that could take take a picture and scan it. It was all like, I got to print this thing out and go stick it over there under that thing, scan it, and then mess with it, And it was really slow. The computers back then were like, there was no real-time editing. It was basically you had to watch stuff scan on one scan line at a time for a change. It was horrible.
Wow.
So again, it was before Photoshop and Illustrator. It was very painful, and I'm glad that I didn't have to deal with that too much because that was the transition where I sort of became a professional designer. That transition was very quick, and then it was only like a year or two where things started to sort of change rapidly, and so it was really good for me. But for other people, it was not so good.
Okay. How did you get into the whole motion design world? You gave us a little bit of a background on that, but do you remember the first motion design project that you worked on? Yeah,
I mean, motion design grew up around me. Like it was, it evolved around me. It was like this perfect storm of technology colliding with art, design, animation, and sort of a need for everybody to change. And so it's kind of like life, right? It's like, when life changes, you have to go with the flow or else, it's a bad thing for you. So really, motion design happened around me, and we all just kind of jumped on it for the ride because we had no choice. But I do remember the first time I really did something and I thought, this is like the game changer for me, and I can see the future. It's one of those kind of like moments, like aha moment where the light bulb goes off and you're like, oh my God, I just discovered something that is going to be the rest of my career. And I was in my early 20s, and I remember I was doing something for the Fox TV show The Simpsons, and it was like an advertisement or a promo for that show. And I remember that the people at Fox said, we're going to advertise, season 2 of The Simpsons. It was like the early Simpsons. And I remember that, again, things were pretty archaic, and, to animate something was really painful because you had to go into an edit suite, and somebody had this huge console of thousands of buttons, and it was just really painful. And so I thought, well, shit, I'm just going to take out my paintbrush, and I actually created the Simpsons characters. I created their house, and then out of foam board, and then I actually created these foam board characters of them that were hand painted, and I put a camera in front of the scene, and I did a bunch of shots of the Simpson, foam board characters moving through the house. And I had like all these weird lights set up on it. And so I just basically just had fun shooting this sort of setup that I created. And so I did a bunch of different angled shots and just got a bunch of stuff. And I took it into an edit suite, and the editor at the time said, what is this? And I said, yeah, I shot this. I think that we can kind of cut this stuff together in kind of a weird way, and then we can like put some typography on it. I remember when I made the typography, I actually used Illustrator, typed it up, printed it out on a black and white, piece of paper, and then I shot that with the camera. And then I took it into the edit suite, and they had to strip out the white part of the paper to leave the matte of the black. And then we changed that to a different color and floated that on top of the end card for the promo. So that was motion design. But I saw at that moment, after I shot everything, and it was all cut together, and then the typography was slapped on at the end, I said, oh, that's cool. That feels right. But I had no idea what that was going to lead to. It just was the only way I knew how to get something moving in my style or in the way that I could do it. So that was the first time I said, this feels like something I'm going to be doing for 25 more years. And so that was, I wish I had a copy of it, but I don't, because that was, you had everything on tape back then.
Yeah.
So I have no files. I don't have the tape. It's just gone. There's nothing. But it's just a memory in my mind, and that's about it. But I just recall, like, the only program I used was Illustrator, and that was to type up the word The Simpsons and, tomorrow at 8 or something, and then I printed it on a piece of paper and then shot it with a camera. It's like if we did that today, people would say, oh, that's great, that's lo-fi, that's so cool. But it's like,
retro.
And I still do that kind of stuff. Like, I'll still scan shit in and, do it, and it's fun. But that was the process, just to do something really basic back then, and it was very painful. But that was my first sort of motion project that I realized that this was gonna change my game. So that was fun.
That sounds extremely fun. I love that story.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, did you ever feel any desire to become an animator or try your hand at making the things move yourself?
Well, funny you say that. I actually don't animate. I actually now I just hire people to do it for me, which is fun and fine. But I remember I was working at a studio a couple of years ago, probably almost, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or 7 years ago, something like that. And I remember we were doing something for National Geographic Channel. And I said, I was the design director, and so I looked at a couple of other, designers and said, I'm going to animate this. And people were like, what? What do you mean? And I said, yeah, I'm going to actually just go ahead and animate this myself, and I don't want to bother anyone. They're like, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I think I'll just figure this out. It's not, I've been around it enough. I understand the process. I just need to, sort of push the buttons and sort of make the moves and get that all set up. And they're like, okay, yeah, you're crazy. And I said, okay. And so the guy sitting behind me at the time, I said, how do you open up, or how do you make a new comp in After Effects? And the guy goes, oh gosh. He goes, you're gonna make me tell you everything. And I said, yeah, actually, I think that's gonna sort of be the case here. And he said, yeah, you just open up, the new comp and do this and do that, set up this. And I said, okay. So I did that. And I said, okay, so with the camera, if I want to sort of like move the camera through the scene, I just kind of do this. He goes, yeah, you got to hit that button and then blah, blah, blah. So I said, cool. So I did that, set up my scene, moved the camera through Z space. And I remember I actually had to rotoscope out some stuff, which everybody was like amazed that I could do that. I said, yeah, that seemed pretty easy. And they were like, what? And I said, yeah, I just rotoscoped it out. And they said, okay. So I kept going, and I think, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 days went by, and I said, okay, I think this is done. And everybody's like, oh, it's like, okay, let's take a look at this thing. Oh my God. And so I played it, and they said, damn, that works. And I said, yeah. Anyway, it looks just like my board because I'm a motion designer. I design for motion, so I know exactly where my key points are going to be in the animation and why they're going to be there, right? So I know exactly where that camera needs to land because I am creating the composition before I do it. So that's the power of knowing design and animation together. They are one and the same. So at the end of that process of animating, I remember we said, okay, we're going to go talk this through to the client and show them what we're doing and see what they think. They had no changes.
Wow.
They had 0 changes. And everybody was like, oh my God, you jerk. And I was like, what? I was like, they're like, how can you, this is like the first thing you've ever animated, and how can it have no changes? I said, because I thought it through precisely the way that I wanted to do it, because I designed the board, I designed everything. So I knew where I wanted the movement to go and how fast and when I wanted it to slow down. And so that proved to me that, yeah, being strictly a designer for motion and being a sort of a total package motion designer, which is also great, but you don't have to be, you can do both. You can do both, or you could do design only, and you can also just do animation. It really doesn't matter to me. It's all the same at the end of the day. But yeah, that's the last time I animated. And
okay.
And since since I have 100% rating, I don't want to ever do it again because I'll blow that good rating. Right?
Yeah, retire now.
Yeah, exactly. But that goes to the idea of planning ahead, creating a very good design board that works, and then you get that signed off by the client, and then you go into animation, and then you just look very closely at the design and the way that it's laid out. And so that's why you spend a great deal of time on the design end, so you get your compositions and your hierarchy and your contrast and all that working well, and the client sees it, so when it's moving, there's no mystery, right?
Right. Yeah, and that is another thing that we are hearing a lot in this course. Another point that I'm trying to make a lot is the importance of doing design before moving on to animation.
Oh, yeah.
And that's something that we cover in detail in Explainer Camp, another course
That's
on
right.
School of Motion. But it's just so critical,
That's right.
like you said, to think it through and be very precise, to make design boards that are already serving their purpose before you take it into motion.
That's right. That's why you do it, because it's one of the most important steps before you. I mean, it is the important step before you animate. And so, yeah, they live together. That's why motion design is so damn powerful. Is because it's the idea of great design mixed with great animation, great storytelling, and it all sort of fuses together. And so we're kind of at the pinnacle of what these two things are doing right now. Like right now is the time where things are really getting awesome, and I think it's only going to get better.
Totally. I 100% agree with that. So we talked a lot about your professional career and how you've kind of had a lot of experience in different stages throughout your career. But throughout this entire time, and even now, are you working on personal work as well?
The last time I did personal work, it was probably 8 years ago, and I did a one-man painting show, and I painted 20 paintings and went and did a show, and that was that. And so since that point, I've been so busy with paying work that I've had no time. Like I don't know what spare time is. Like I wish I had more. So what I try to do, so I don't go absolutely crazy, I try to inject a little bit of myself into every project I work on, so I feel like I'm winning a little bit over the client, even though it's not a competition. It's basically I just try to infuse something in my design that makes me feel like an artist and makes me feel good. So I think clients see that, and I think they see the enthusiasm that you put into your work, and they appreciate it. So that's how I try to sort of get around this. Like I don't have any personal time because I'm working all the time, but that's kind of how I deal with that. But I feel like from a motivational standpoint, to create personal work is a good thing for everybody to strive to do if you can, because we all have that thing inside us, that imposter syndrome that sort of pops up every so often, and it's a real thing, and it's a trigger. It's a trigger for why we do personal work, is because we all think we suck. I know I do. I look at everyone else and say, oh my God, these people are amazing. You know, it's like, how can they be doing this kind of work? And how am I not doing that? You know, why can't I do that? And so we all feel that, because people, I'm sure some people look at maybe my work and say, oh, that's awesome. Oh, yeah, I want to do that one day. Well, I'm sure they will, because it's, you know, it's just practice, you know. So, so the whole personal work thing is good to do. It's just, you know, you just got to have time, and you don't want to be burned out. But if you have too much work, then, you know, just trying to put a little bit of yourself into each project may be the key, so you don't absolutely burn yourself out. But but we all have that syndrome in us. I do, you do, we all do, that, you know, that people are better than us, and therefore we suck, and, you know, we need to work harder. And that's the motivation that makes us all better.
Right. I agree with that too. And I love that you're able to find a sense of accomplishment in the work that you're doing for your clients. I think that's something that's also really important, to be able to not just be looking at your career as how you're producing income and surviving, but enjoying what you're doing for a living, especially in a creative field, is so important. And it's great that you found that. I feel like I've been able to be very fortunate to find my place in this whole crazy industry, and just being an educator has been a thrill for me, and it doesn't get old. That's the part that I love. Yeah, no, I've enjoyed that part of it as well, as trying to, you know, educate myself to help educate other people by giving, you know, a life experience that I've had, and try to channel it through other people to help them. You know, it's awesome. Yeah. But if we think about, you know, one thing that I think is important to talk about when we're talking about your career and your work habits and these programs, I mean, the programs, think about, like, Photoshop. I have used Photoshop probably around 40,000 hours throughout my career so far. So there's 40,000 hours I've spent with a program. That's a shit ton of time. I mean, that is a ton of time that I've spent with one stupid program, but that's my life, right? That's my career. And I've spent more time with Photoshop than I have probably with my wife, my parents. So it's a love-hate relationship that you build with your program, like, you know, like Photoshop or Illustrator. You build this relationship, and our lives are full of rhythms, right? It's like we sleep, we eat the same way, we exercise, some of us do, we rest, and then we go back to work, we eat, and we do things in a sort of a internal rhythm, and everybody has a little bit of a different rhythm. But we all have these rhythms, and so using Photoshop or Illustrator is like part of the rhythm of your life. And so if you treat it as like, okay, I wake up, I open up Photoshop, I start to work, I start to get into, you know, the creative mode, you know, it sort of clicks on. And now I'm in my rhythm, and I'm using the program. It's an extension of me, right? It becomes this thing that you're familiar with because you do it every day. It's a rhythmic experience. It's like a good jazz song. It just kind of keeps going. It's like click, click, move, tap, tap, cut, move. You know, it's like a rhythm. It's like you're clicking, you're moving, you're tapping, and that sort of experience, you know, that it's an experience that's physical. It makes you feel a certain way. So every time you sit in front of the program and you're doing your hand movements and you're looking and you're searching, you're thinking, that's a rhythm that's internal to your body. So therefore, if you're going to be around a program for 40,000 to 50 to 60,000 hours of your life, you need to sort of, you got to become one with it somehow. It's like you got to become a Jedi with your program, or you know, it's not going to work because you spend more time with Photoshop or Illustrator than you do
people. And so
right.
you have to, like, that's the Zen that I was talking about earlier. You get into this Zen moment while you're using these programs to help you sort of get through these hours. But as you know, when you're doing something you really love, time flies by. And so as creative people, we're really lucky because we get to really get excited about what we do for a living, and time does fly by when you're having a good time with it. So yeah, it is like a good jazz song. It's like you're hearing the movement, and you're seeing the movement of your body with the program and the machine, and yeah, it's like you're one with it, which is kind of a good way to, I think, to look at it when you have to, deal with it with, it's using so many hours, with all those hours that you're spending with that program, you need to sort of feel at peace with it.
So after using these programs for so long and them being such a big part of your life, do you ever feel like there's going to be a point in your life where you're just done? Like you're ready to retire or something? Or are you just going to always have that same feeling as when you were much younger and just starting to develop your design eye and just wanting to continue to create?
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever stop looking and exploring at visual like relationships. I mean, that at the core is design. That's those visual things out there and how they're sort of paired together and why they get paired together and why that works. Like that is what gets you excited as a designer or an artist or a creative person, is you see these things unfold and your brain absorbs that thing and it likes it. And it can sort of turn it around and do different things to what you're seeing. And that's the creative part of you, is you're manipulating what you're seeing and you're making it better, you're making it cooler looking, you're making it more exciting. And that's why we're programmed the way we are, is because we enjoy seeing that kind of stuff. Like if I'm in a different country, or if I'm on vacation, or if I'm just sort of walking around and my mind is idle, well, that's when I'm usually more sort of in tune with what's going on around me, and I really, like, I'm seeing stuff, right? I'm seeing the abstract shapes, I'm seeing, all the positive and negative spaces colliding, and I'm kind of looking at those things, and I don't think I'll ever stop doing that. And I think that's what makes an artist a good artist or a good designer, is because you're constantly trying to find that. It's like, if you're a chef or if you like to cook, you like to cook great food so you can eat it or watch other people eat it. And so it makes you feel good to do the process of cooking because it's relaxing or it's therapeutic or whatever the reason. But, you don't want to stop eating, right? You don't want to stop cooking and eating because that makes you feel good. So, I like to wake up every day and do something that makes me feel good. So I think at a certain point, I'll probably stop doing a lot of client work, because sometimes that can be, incredibly stressful, not because of me or the process of being a designer, but just the process of working with other people and a corporation and all the stuff that brings. So I think one day I will definitely stop doing, paying work and all that, because I'll probably take my French easel and go back out into the field and start painting, landscapes and clouds and, whatever else I want to do. But I'll still be creating. And that's, I think, Henri Matisse, he was like bedridden for some of the last years of his life as an artist. And I remember he created some beautiful cut paper designs that I see pop up today in different styles. And he was doing that when he was, I don't know when he died exactly, but he was probably in his 80s or something. And, he didn't stop. He kept creating because that's who he is. And so, so I don't know if I'll ever stop creating, but I will stop probably working for, clients and, going through that sort of grind every day, because that does wear on you after after too many years. You start to, you do start to break down a little bit. So you can't, you just can't keep going like you're, 21 years old. You can't just be 21 forever. That'd be cool, but I don't know. What about you?
The technology isn't there yet.
Yeah. How do you feel? How do you feel every day?
I think I'm very similar to you, where I catch myself first thing in the morning, I'm immediately just immersing myself in the motion design community and trying to find new inspiration and thinking about
Exactly.
how can I get myself involved in this today. And almost to a fault, where I kind of forget about my responsibilities for the day and how I have a family and I'm a dad and it's not a big problem or anything, but it's something that's inherently part of my being.
That's right.
It's in my blood of wanting to just experience these new things and see what people are doing on a day-to-day basis, and then trying to contribute to that.
That's right. So
whether it's for a client or not.
That's right. So it's one of those things that we as artists, that's what we like to do. So therefore, if it makes us feel good, you just keep doing it.
Exactly. We've already heard some amazing gold nuggets in all of this, but I'm wondering, you started with Photoshop very early on, but do you feel like there's anything that you wish you had known before you started learning Adobe software?
Well, probably not, just because I didn't know what it was. I
Right.
wish there were tutorials back when I first started. That's the one thing. All we had back in the wild early days were these Adobe manuals, and the manuals from Adobe were rather dry. They only explained sort of the basic functions of the program, nothing too fancy. And so a lot of us were, we were in the dark. So I wish
Right.
there was better support back then. Just for the program itself. So tutorials would have been, crucial and essential. That would have helped out quite a bit. So it was a lot of word of mouth sort of stuff, like, hey, how do you do this? Somebody'd say, I don't know. Let's try that. And you'd be like, no, that doesn't work. What about this? No. And you just sort of fumble through, and you'd say, oh, look, I found it. There it is. Oh my God. Everybody'd be like, oh my God, really? What is that? And so that, the tutorials would have been great. But also the community, like the community of motion designers now that exist. There's really awesome groups like School of Motion and others that add some level of support and kind of comfort and stability to kind of the whole industry, right? That would have been nice back then, to have this sort of instant sort of group. Like, hey, we're, a bunch of, several thousand people, or, 100,000 people, we're here to hear your problems, and we know what your problems are. We have the same problems. Here, take a look at this. Doesn't that look cool? Oh my God, where'd you get that? Oh, over here. Cool. Okay. That kind of back and forth and that sort of instant gratification is pretty awesome. And we just, back when I first started, that did not exist unless it was right next to you in the room. So it's just nice to have other people, like-minded people, that sort of push you and to make you better. And it also makes you feel, with a community, it makes you feel like you're not alone in your journey, because it's really important to have other creative people beside you to help, just kind of give you that extra little boost to help you get through a tough period, or, maybe you're, having a mental block and you just can't sort of figure it out. So it's nice to kind of get that sort of, bouncing board of people to say, yeah, we feel your pain, and we all, we also understand it. So, that's, the community is really awesome. So,
yeah, I think the students who are in this class right now, like, I'm sure you can be, you're probably a little jealous of them, just based on that desire for community. I mean, you've got it good now with the internet, the instant communication, and just the number of resources that you have accessible to learning these programs. That it isn't a barrier anymore.
No, it's certainly not. The only barrier is yourself,
right?
For not wanting to do something, or not having the time because you're screwing around doing other stupid things or whatever. It's really, there's no excuse for there's just tutorials about everything. Oh my God. Right. It's like, here's a tutorial of how to eat. And you're like, oh, okay. That's not basic enough. I need to learn how to eat.
Right.
Okay. So so that would have been cool back in the day. But hey, it's great that everybody has their process, and again, it's not about the the commands and the clicks, that you go through within the program. It's about how you use the program and what your state of mind is, so you can actually create, sort of magic through the program. It's just a tool,
Right. I love it. Okay, this might be a tough question for you, but if you can, try to give us your 2 best tips for someone that might be looking to improve their design skills.
Well, yeah, design's tough. That's the first thing is, it's a tough road. It's, but I guess in my humble opinion, the first thing you have to do to really be a designer is you've got to learn to see. You have to learn to look. You have to open your eyes, right? You have to see things in a new kind of way. You have to learn, to see visual relationships between things in a certain way. You have to sort of make that connection out there in the world. You have to look and stare. You have to be a really good observer to be a good designer. So a good designer can, look at positive and negative space and sort of turn that spatial relationship into something, sort of magical, right? And that's not easy to do. And the mystery, I think, behind a good designer is their ability to see the world around them and know how to interpret what they see into a usable visual language, right? I mean, a lot of great designers just practice that. A lot of good designers have good design habits that they practice over and over in repetition. So you don't have to be awesome and the best person in design. You don't have to be like the people that we all worship. You don't have to be those people to be a good designer. You just have to practice good design habits. You have to practice the fundamentals over and over and over in repetition, so you start to see how those principles work for you. Because each of us have different things that we like to do, right? And we do it in a different way. And by doing things in repetition, you get that muscle memory and you start to say, okay, this works and I see why this works, so I'm going to do it again and again. And as a designer, you do things over and over because you know it's going to work. And then once you figure out, like, okay, I totally understand how that works, then you start to mutate that. And then once you mutate it, you pull it over here to something else, and then you apply it to that because you never have. But you understand it now. So once you understand that thing that you mutate and you move over to something else you're doing, you add it to that and you go, oh, that's a new discovery. And then you say, okay, I do the basics. You learn the fundamentals of design first. And then once you figure out that something works, because the fundamentals of design work because they've been tested over time. And so that's why we know they work. And so once you discover the principles of design and how they function within the relationship between things, because that's really what design is. It's just moving things around and creating different relationships. And so once you figure out those relationships and you practice that in repetition, then you mutate it, and then you start to make new discoveries, and that's how you advance, and that's how you create your style. And that is the first thing I would say would probably make somebody a better designer, is to actually figure out that process for themselves, but figure it out first before you mutate it or change it, and before you discover something else. You just want to make sure you get the fundamentals and the basics right first. And when we're talking about the basics and the principles, the second thing I think that's really important for anybody who's designing, that includes me and that includes the best people out there, is to learn the design principle of contrast. Contrast is that one principle. If you can master that design fundamental, you're going to be really effective as a communication artist, because contrast is things like contrast in size, contrast in scale, what's big, what's small. If something's big, you're going to tell the viewer to look at that thing that's big, and if that thing's small, the viewer's probably not going to look at that first. So as a communication artist, you're telling that viewer, I'm going to make this thing big and make it the focal point so you see it. So you're actually in power. You have the power as the designer to tell the audience what to look at by using contrast and size. So contrast is size, scale, and it's contrast in value. So value is something that's light or dark. So for example, if something is light on a dark background, that thing that's light is going to pop off that background. And that's a really simple principle, but it works. And so if you have something that's like, I don't know, a dark gray over a black background, you may not see it as much, right? Because it's dark gray, and so it sort of blends into the background. There's very little contrast there. But if that's your decision to make that choice, then your choice is you're using contrast to hide that thing on the background because it's almost the same value. So contrast and value is another thing that's incredibly important, along with contrast and size and scale, because it creates a focal point and it creates balance, it creates hierarchy. So contrast is that principle. If you can just practice that in repetition, just using contrast, making something big, making something small, that just goes a long way in showing not only motion, because in motion design, you're showing the contrast between this frame and that frame to show movement. So if you're showing movement between frames by using contrast, then that is what you're really doing, and it's very basic. But a lot of people don't know that until they do it, and then it opens up a whole, new universe. So contrast adds that sort of message. It kind of gives your design a focal point. It gives it a message. It kind of reinforces the idea of what you as a designer want your audience to look at. So that's important. And another thing I think is really important is just there's a lot of noise in the world. There always has been, but there's a lot of noise today, especially. And I think being a good designer is learning how to manage the chaos and turning that chaos into smart, usable, understandable sort of visual messages. Because design is about looking, and it's about looking and more looking, staring, and then you apply those design fundamentals to whatever project you're working on. But I think the whole idea of people observing and looking at things closely, I think we just all need to slow down a little bit and just be a little more patient, because I think the process of design is a therapeutic process of observing and then taking that observation and then turning that into something that's visual, that says something. Because again, we're visual communicators, and that's our job. And our job is to communicate an idea. And by slowing down your process and by slowing down your mind, I think you can clearly see things. And if you're staring and looking and observing closer, I think you'll just be in a better place as a designer, because you're going to be thinking through the process and it's going to make more sense to you. And those are sort of the three things that I think are really important to help your workflow, as a designer, because there's a lot of little moving pieces that go into being a motion designer, and you have to occasionally just slow down and think about what you're doing.
Fantastic response to that answer, or that question. I think that I got more than I bargained for with that that response.
Well, I could keep going, I guess, but it would take another 2 or 3 hours.
Right.
But that's just one principle of design is, like contrast, for example. That's just one way, to look at design and look at the power of what design is. And, motion design is equally, I still see motion design and design sort of as the same sort of thing. I don't see them as two separate pieces. It's just design is the way to communicate how things look. And then, when you move those things, then that's even more powerful, because, you get the idea that motion is helping you tell your story. But design is an awesome thing it's something that's powerful, that's it makes you feel good if you love it. And so
Awesome. And speaking of those design principles that you're mentioning, like contrast, you happen to have a little course on School of Motion that might touch on some of that, don't you?
Oh, that. Oh, yeah.
I'd love to get a little bit of an overview of that.
Well, Design Boot Camp is, about it. And it
sure
is,
do.
it can be painful for some people, and it's all about the pain of being a creative design thinker, basically, is what Design Boot Camp is. And but it's really fun. It's a fun course, but it's demanding. It is demanding because, like all the School of Motion, courses, we throw a lot of stuff at you, and so basically, students will watch me struggle through real world based projects, and they get to watch me kind of screw around in Photoshop and Illustrator for many hours, and they watch me fail, which is okay, but in the end, I try to sort of figure out stuff, sort of. But that's all up for interpretation, and that's how design works. But so basically, Design Boot Camp is great because they're watching me go through a real-world project, and they get to see, sort of my process of how I move around Photoshop and sort of, how I do this and do that, and I give a lot of tips on like, hey, I'm going to make, a shape layer, and I'm going to take that shape layer and add a point to it and drag it out, and then I'm going to, blur it out, and then I'm going to add texture to it, and I'm going to go online to my Pinterest board and grab this. Okay, boom, I'm going to drop it into Photoshop. I'm going to put that over this photograph. Okay, cool. And now let's lay out some typography. Oh, let's get into Illustrator. We're going to make a title. Oh, what's a title? Oh, let me show you. And then we go through different processes just like that, and it's a very intensive, course designed to help students at the end of the course load up their portfolios with some really awesome, motion design boards. And Design Boot Camp is all about practicing and using, like I said earlier, in repetition, the fundamentals and principles of design. And so we try to build good muscle memory habits throughout the class. And if students can learn by the end of the course how to dissect a client brief, then it's my hope that once they dissect that brief and they come up with a visual solution that solves the brief, then it's going to be a big win for them. And so that's my hope, that the students that go through the boot camp will begin to use good design principles to solve problems, right?
Right.
And so, by the end of the course, someone, maybe would find their own sort of creation process by watching me struggle through projects. And by watching me struggle and design using Photoshop, students will sort of begin to figure out like how they can start to solve these sort of complex problems using design and using Photoshop to approach a client project from start to finish. And it's not an easy journey. Design Boot Camp is not an easy path, but we do see a lot of growth within, just only 8 weeks.
Absolutely.
And design, is a lifelong thing. So after 8 weeks, you're not done. You're not even close to being done. It's just the beginning, but it's a swift kick in the pants, which is awesome. And I think a lot of people that have taken the course go into it and they think, oh my God, I just don't know if I can do this, or I'm just not good enough, or oh my gosh, all these other people are going to look at my design and they're just going to say, oh my gosh, why are you here? But that's not the case, because everybody is there for support. And I'm usually, trolling the Facebook group and, saying different things. And, it's a good experience, I think, and I think other people have enjoyed it. And really, at the end of the day, it's like explainer boot camp. You just want people to leave the boot camp with a portfolio that they can be proud of and they can move forward with and actually help them get work. That's the whole.
Right.
That's the goal. So that's Design Boot Camp. It's a pretty intensive sort of stare at how to make really quick, slick-looking design style frames. So you can put them in a board and they make sense. And so
right.
that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and I can 100% vouch for that. Like you mentioned, I went through design boot camp. I think I was even in the beta session.
Yeah,
it is I think the pinnacle of what a boot camp course actually is. It is very intense, but I mean, at the end of that course, you're equipped with so much knowledge and wisdom that you can immediately start applying to your own work. So just like this course is teaching you how to use Photoshop and Illustrator at the technical level and getting introduced into the world of motion design and how the whole production process works, you can take what you learn here into Design Bootcamp and start putting it to work and starting to learn these design principles that Mike was talking about and just immediately see growth in that 6-week span. It's just amazing how much you can grow in that little bit.
That's right. Thank you, Jake. Yep. So you listen to Jake, watch what he does in this class, and that's the way you're supposed to do it, right? That's the good way. And then you take Design Bootcamp and you get to watch like, oh, let's throw a grenade into this and see what happens. But it's fun because it's you get to sort of take your scissors and cut stuff up, and you make a mess, and you get to like move the program around in really weird ways, and you're just like, oh God, look, this screen over here, let me just move this out of the way. What is that? It's like, I don't even know the quick command. Like, what is that? It's like, oh, that doesn't work. Oh, okay. That's Design Bootcamp. But yeah, listen to Jake. He'll tell you exactly how to really operate Photoshop and Illustrator, and then take Design Bootcamp, and then you can just have fun.
There you go.
That's right.
Love it.
That's the difference. So yeah, no. But I think it's all Photoshop, Illustrator, design, animation. It's all good. It is just a good time, and everybody should be doing it.
I couldn't agree more. Mike, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day. I know that you're a busy guy, but we really appreciate you stopping by and talking to our students.
This was awesome, Jake, and thank you. And everybody out there, just keep going. Just keep going, because that's all we have to do, right?
That's right.
All right, man. Take care.
What a fascinating conversation. I learned so much about Mike and his career through that interview. What I hope you got out of our conversation was the idea that design is a way to almost live your life. It's how you view the world and how you see things interacting with each other, and that can be applied to anything. It doesn't have to just be motion design. But as Mike was telling that crazy story about how he decided he was going to make an animation for a project that he had designed, even though he basically had no experience in After Effects, he had seen the process enough that animating itself wasn't much of an obstacle. If anything, it was just knowing what buttons to press in After Effects to get what he wanted to happen. What he had designed translated into motion because he put thought into the way that it should move. And Mike also mentioned a term in that particular story, rotoscoping, which you might not be familiar with. That's basically cutting out something from video 1 frame at a time. So the same way that we're making selections around people and removing them from their backgrounds, sometimes you have to do that, but for footage. And footage is generally 24 frames per second, which is why the rest of his team thought that he would be crazy to rotoscope something on his first time in After Effects. But because he was so experienced with Photoshop and cutting things out, it came naturally to him. And I again just want to reinforce my recommendation of Design Bootcamp. Once you've moved on from this course and gotten some experience in these programs, Design Bootcamp is such a great course for you to start learning design principles and thinking in different ways about how to create art for motion design. And I realize I am a little bit biased since I am also a School of Motion instructor, but I started just like you, and I was a student before I was an instructor, and I'm always going to be a student for as long as I continue to learn. Thanks for listening to this episode, and I'll talk to you in the next one.